Please be seated. Proceedings are resumed.
Public Lands Commission, Cayman Islands Annual Report 2017, 2018, and 2019, to be laid on the table by the Honourable Minister of Education, Youth, Sports, Agriculture and Lands.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to lead on the floor of this Honourable House the Public Lands Commission, Cayman Islands Annual Report 2017.
Ordered. Is the Minister speaking?
No, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with your kind indulgence, out of the abundance of caution, we're seeking to lay the annual report for 2017, 2018, and 2019, although they're stapled together as one bundle. Do not wish to speak on any of the three,
No,
sir.
I thought that's what you had done in the very first instance, the three. But out of an abundance of caution, so ordered.
Board of Governance Annual Report 2019, the University College of the Cayman Islands, to be laid on the table by the Honourable Minister of Education, Youth, Sports, Agriculture and Lands.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you kindly, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to lay on the floor of this Honourable House the Board of Governors Annual Report 2019 for the University College of the Cayman Islands.
So ordered. Is the Minister speaking there too?
Only to say that the report is a good one and it's self-explanatory. I would invite members to so peruse at their leisure.
Questions to Honourable Ministers and members of the Cabinet?
No questions. So.
Statements by the Honourable Ministers and members of the Cabinet.
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to announce that Cabinet has approved a national COVID-19 vaccination plan for the Cayman Islands this week. We have had much success with the control of COVID-19 on these shores, and much now depends on us maintaining the momentum. We'll build further on our achievements with this plan and provide a strong foundation for the safe recovery of the Cayman Islands' global economic interests while safeguarding the health of our people. We have all been waiting for the availability of a safe and well-tested vaccine against the dangerous viral disease COVID-19. One such vaccine with a very convincing success rate has now been approved separately in both Canada and the United Kingdom. The Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine is already being rolled out in the United Kingdom. A veritable Christmas gift in a country where tens of thousands of people have already died as a result of the pandemic. Approval by the Food and Drug Administration in the United States of America is expected shortly. To support the overseas territories in the fight against this virus, the United Kingdom government is arranging to deliver supplies of vaccinations, and it is anticipated the deliveries will start in early January. Mr. Speaker, we are hopeful that Cayman will see its first batch arrive in the first week of next year. We anticipate receiving a sufficient number of vaccines in the first batch to immunize several thousand people. Additionally, government has contracted with the coronavirus COVAX facility organized by the International Vaccines Agency, Gavi, to provide further vaccines through this mechanism, which also supports countries less able to fund vaccination programs themselves. Mr. Speaker, the approval of the vaccine in the United Kingdom brings us closer to ensuring the safety of those at greatest risk from the effects of COVID-19. This includes those who are older and who have certain defined conditions and diseases that make them more vulnerable to the effects of the coronavirus. And Mr. Speaker, while I am not yet in those ranks, I will say that I will be one of the first in line to take the vaccine and to lead by example and to demonstrate my confidence in the safety of the vaccine. A question that is already on everyone's lips is how government will prioritize vaccination throughout our community. I can tell you that the objectives of the national plan closely align with those set out by major public health agencies such as the Pan American Health Organization and Public Health England. Our goals are as follows: to protect the integrity of the healthcare system and infrastructure for the continuity of essential services by vaccinating health workers at all levels of care and other essential services established in the country, to reduce the severe morbidity and mortality associated with COVID-19 by protecting the populations at greatest risk from the disease, and to reduce transmission of infection in the community and generate widespread immunity by expanding vaccination to other groups. This will be achieved when vaccines become more available through 2021. There is work to be done to successfully reach these objectives before the vaccine arrives, much of which is already underway. Government has already begun to implement a communication plan to answer any concerns the public may have and to address the considerable misinformation that is already in the public domain. Since last week, detailed information about COVID-19 vaccinations has been available from the frequently asked questions section of the government's coronavirus website, exploregov.ky/coronavirus. Further information will also be forthcoming shortly in this regard. The Health Services Authority has large quantities of syringes, needles, sharps boxes, and equipment on order for delivery of the doses. Specialized freezers have also been ordered by the Health Services Authority, and there is already one such freezer at Health City with spare capacity able to meet our needs. Senior management and public health teams at the Health Services Authority are confident they will be able to commence this mass vaccination program using existing resources. Mr. Speaker, consultation has also been undertaken with both private and public healthcare providers to better inform them of the plans and to allow them to offer the resources to deliver the vaccinations. Health officials believe that with all preparations in place, they should be able to vaccinate some 3,000 people per week. Once the vaccine arrives on island, a number of groups have been prioritized for the voluntary vaccination. These include healthcare workers and institutional residents, because this reduces the risk of spread between caregivers and those they care for, and protects those that are not able to physically distance because of their situation. Frontline customer-facing staff working at ports who are constantly exposed to the risks from travelers. Those over age of 60 and people suffering from conditions liable to put them at increased risk if they were to contract COVID-19. and workers who are essential for the continuity of government services. Mr. Speaker, the second stage of the voluntary vaccination program will consist of the delivery of the vaccine to essential service workers, teachers, and school staff, those living in the households of anyone from the Stage 1 vaccination program. The Ministry of Health has proposed the further opening of borders after Stage 2, around 1 month into the start of the overall vaccination program, by which time we should have vaccinated our most vulnerable. The following restrictions would apply for people arriving from overseas. All travelers entering the islands must be able to show that they have received an approved vaccine course against the virus which causes COVID-19. This should have been completed before arrival, according to recommendations by the Public Health Department. They must also receive negative results from a PCR test upon arrival. Persons who meet these conditions will be exempted from quarantine if living in households where the other residents have also received a vaccine. All people who are exempted from quarantine in this manner, including the households, will undergo repeat testing on day 5, day 10, and day 15 following the arrival date. Regular PCR screening will continue with safety restrictions for healthcare workers, healthcare establishments, nursing homes, and prisons. Those involved in hosting travelers, including all port workers, hotel workers, restaurateurs, bar workers, leisure companies, taxi drivers, and anyone else working in tourism will be required to be screened for COVID-19 disease at regular intervals. Mr. Speaker, additional PCR testing capacity by the HSA, Doctors Hospital, and Health City should be able to match any increase in demand. The HSA and Public Health Department will also monitor the situation and promptly request any additional human resources necessary to this goal. Rapid testing may also be used to provide simpler access to testing for COVID-19 disease. But, Mr. Speaker, I used the word may because it should be noted that widespread use of this in citywide sampling programs elsewhere has shown disappointing sensitivity in that it has only picked up between 50 and 70% of people who have COVID-19. The final stage of the vaccination program will consist of vaccinating the remainder of the population for whom the vaccines are intended. Again, Mr. Speaker, I underline that the vaccine taking the vaccine is voluntary. Mr. Speaker, while the vaccine has yet to arrive here, I would like to take this opportunity to encourage all those people listening to these proceedings to do their due diligence and to keep their minds open to the many benefits that participation in the voluntary national vaccination program will offer. It is an opportunity for us as individuals to take action to protect this community that we love so much and which has done so much for us, while at the same time we protect ourselves. I will end by assuring this Honourable House that government will remain vigilant throughout this process as we monitor the rollout of the vaccination, the proposed travel changes, and their impact on our society. Should there be an indication of substantial and worrisome community transmission of COVID-19 cases in the Cayman Islands, or if we were required to move up a suppression level, preventive measures will promptly be tightened through public health regulations as they have been in the past. If this happens, we will see a return to the wearing of masks in public places, physical distancing, and the use of protective barriers to minimize further spread of the COVID-19 disease. Mr. Speaker, as I said before, the successful development and imminent arrival of the vaccine seems like the Christmas gift we have all been waiting for. At the same time, the vaccine is still not yet here. When it arrives, it will greatly reduce our chances of getting COVID-19 and the potential severity of the illness if we should contract it, if we take it, but nothing is guaranteed. Mr. Speaker, we must continue to practice the preventive measures that we have followed thus far, including washing hands, practicing respiratory hygiene, and following social distancing recommendations. Doing so will ensure that we in the Cayman Islands stay safe through the holidays and into 2021. Mr. Speaker, I have one other short statement to make.
Speaker.
Oh, sorry.
Mr. Speaker, I rise.
The member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise on standing orders 32 to ask a short question to the minister who offered the statement.
Proceed. Short.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the minister repeat the sentence that I think obviously may not be in his statement that he read that came after the sentence that says, to support the overseas territories in the fight against this virus, the UK government is arranging to deliver supplies of vaccinations and his anticipated deliveries will start in early January. Then he said a sentence that didn't seem to be on the statement. So you have a different statement than the one that was offered to us? 'Cause I tried to always follow through, but you said another sentence, but that sentence wasn't on this.
What was that sentence?
I'm trying to remember what it is. That's my point.
I don't remember either.
Well, you read it.
Huh?
You read it.
Well, I don't read exactly the statement.
The Honorable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in accordance with 32, I too would like to ask the Premier short questions. Mr. Speaker,
Proceed.
I wonder if the Premier can tell us how many, if he can, that is, how many, and under what arrangement will we be getting the vaccines from the UK?
What do you mean by arrangement?
We paying for them, they paying for them, how many it is.
Mr. Chairman, there is no cost to the overseas territories. The UK is looking after the territories. These are going to be received free of cost to all of the territories. It is difficult to say precisely how many we will get, which is why I use the rather vague expression, several thousand, enough to vaccinate several thousands of our people. And the reason for that is not because anyone is being coy, but the UK had expected to receive 40 million doses by now, and in fact they've wound up with 800,000. These are being shipped from Belgium, and so those that the UK are currently administering are from that 800,000 batch. They expect to get 40 million by Christmas. And if all goes according to plan, then the territories will get from that. I am hesitant to say precisely how much, because the truth is there are still some contingencies about these. But the indication is that we should have several thousand by the first week in January, and if everything goes according to plan. But there may be some slippage in these dates.
Honorable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wonder if the Premier can tell us, albeit that this is voluntary, will we be in a position that if the entire country volunteers to take it, that we can have the vaccine available to do that?
Premier.
Mr. Speaker, at some point, that is certainly the goal we are working towards. It's going to be the availability of the vaccine that is going to dictate those sorts of things. The number of encouraging things, but the AstraZeneca vaccine is also, the indications are that it will shortly be approved. And this is much easier to transport because it only has to be kept at temperatures of, I shouldn't say only, but of -8 degrees instead of -70 or -75. And indications are we might be able to get this through the United States, which means it's generally easier to get here. So this is constantly evolving. I am hopeful that there is significant uptake in the population willingness to take the vaccine. It'll take us some time to work through that first batch, and I'm hoping that by the time we've through with that, other batches of it will have been received, and we can carry on with the program. Mr. Speaker, I'm going out on a limb here, which I'm not sure everyone, even within the government administration, I don't mean the elected members, will necessarily agree. But I am hopeful that if things go well, that we could be in a position by March where we can start to feel quite secure about opening the borders, because we would have had enough of our people here inoculated to create the oft talked about herd immunity, which will protect the entire community. Again, all of these things are contingent upon how well we are able to convince our population that the right thing to do is to take the vaccine. But I expect, Mr. Speaker, also, I spend a lot of time reading and following what's happening with this around the world, is that in developed countries, it is going to swiftly become a requirement that you have to have taken the vaccine to enter places like the United States and the United Kingdom and many other countries around the world. And that in of itself is going to spur a lot of people to take the vaccine. But this landscape is constantly evolving, so we just have to watch and wait and do our part.
The member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the minister say, has there been any discussions about potential liabilities and risk to the government or to the UK government for that fact, for any potential, and I hate to bring up the potential negatives or try to bring it down on this, but there's a major concern out there about vaccines and their safety and the fact that these vaccines are being found so quickly. So I have to also share the voice of those persons who feel that way. Has the government considered or have any discussions about the liabilities to us as a country, or is the UK prepared to accept or discuss with the government about the liabilities if something goes wrong with these vaccines to our people?
Honorable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, if something goes wrong, it won't just go wrong in Cayman. It'll be an international issue. But what we are certain of in terms of liabilities is that up until just now, when I checked, there are more than 270,000 Americans or people in the United States dead of this disease, and more than 1 million across the world. We simply cannot sit on our hands and be so blinded by fear that we allow our people to get sick and die of this disease because we are too afraid to proceed with a tested vaccine, which the experts tell us is safe.
The member for Georgetown Central.
Mr. Speaker, I do support the Premier's response, but I still would ask that he answer the question. Now, I know that we cannot sit on our hands, but has he had any discussions about potential liabilities? Please, I know it's political season, but answer the question that I put to him, please, because it's important that there's other people out there who have that concern.
Mr. Speaker, I've said all I intend to say about that. Mr. Speaker, with your permission, sir, I have another statement which is unrelated to this matter. Mr. Speaker, I am happy to provide this Honourable House with an update about the Cayman Islands Regiment. I know that despite us getting the defense bill through last meeting, there remain abiding concerns among members of the opposition and perhaps even some opposition among members of the opposition to the Cayman Islands Regiment. And so I am happy to impart some more good news about the regiment since I last spoke about them during that debate. Many will have read that Second Lieutenant Nathan Dec became the second in the regiment's short history to win Best International Student Award at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, following in the footsteps of Lieutenant Halston Farley, who won the award while on the same course in May. Second Lieutenant Dec passed out of the British Army institution in November, along with fellow Caymanian officer cadet Tyler Lawson and other overseas territories cadets following an 8-week course at Sandhurst, which included leadership, fitness, decision-making, and giving them the skills to support their regiments. The two of them are nearing the end of their time in quarantine since returning from the United Kingdom. To date, 7 officers from the regiment have graduated from Sandhurst, and more recruits will be sent there in the future. The United Kingdom, in tandem with the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, will continue to arrange for and fund training and future recruits at Sandhurst. Personally, Mr. Speaker, the success of our Caymanian officers at Sandhurst and the awards received has come as no surprise to me. The resilience, dedication, and commitment of all our recruits are admirable and highly commendable. We saw that dedication as they worked in the aftermath of Tropical Storm Eta. It was truly a heartwarming moment to spend time with them and to see them at work. The 17 personnel deployed during ETA were spread across all districts of Grand Cayman and were heavily involved in support to Hazard Management Cayman in reconnaissance, delivery of vital supplies, and evacuating persons from flooded properties and transporting them to a safe location. Right now, the strength of the regiment is 58, with 69% of their number being Caymanian. In an update I received from Lieutenant Colonel Simon Watson on yesterday, there are 55 candidates in the latter stages of the selection process prior to basic training, which begins in February. They range in age from 18 to 50, and of these, 67% are Caymanian, and their number includes a number of candidates from Cayman Brac. These recruits will be trained by a short-term training team from the United Kingdom military, which is scheduled to arrive in late January and undertake a mandatory 14-day quarantine before kicking off the 2-week course. The training team coming from the United Kingdom will also bring full supplies of kit and equipment for the new recruits, as well as additional kit for the existing reservists. Looking ahead, Mr. Speaker, the year 2021 will involve initial training of Cohort 2 and continued training for Cohort 1. There will also be an emphasis on the procurement of vehicles and equipment to allow the safe training and deployment of the regiment. Mr. Speaker, our regiment is a reserve force whose main duties include providing humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, assisting the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service and the Cayman Islands Coast Guard when called upon, as well as to participate during ceremonial occasions. Their motto is prepared in adversity, and it speaks to their purpose. Given the training already provided and being planned, this Honourable House can be assured that this government takes this motto seriously. I again express my appreciation to the Governor and his staff and to the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office for their unwavering support for the Cayman Islands Regiment. Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud of the way in which the regiment is developing, and I look forward to providing further updates as the men and women in the Cayman Islands Regiment continue to do good works and to gain accolades.
I have statements from the Honorable Deputy Governor.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Mr. Speaker, I wish to make a statement concerning the arrangements and safety measures for persons quarantined at residence or in government-run facilities. Mr. Speaker, in the fight to protect our citizens and residents from the global effect of COVID-19 pandemic, the Cayman Islands government has achieved what few other countries around the world has been able to do: to contain the virus and stop community spread. As a result, here in the Cayman Islands, we have created a safe haven where we have been able to relax many of the restrictions imposed at the start of the pandemic. And life has largely returned to normal for those of us who are blessed to reside in these islands. With continued vigilance, we have remained free from community transmission of the COVID-19 disease, even as we moved from a full closure of our borders in March 2020 to a phased opening in October 2020. Mr. Speaker, one of the most important public health measures we have employed to prevent the spread of COVID-19 is a mandatory 14-day quarantine requirement for all incoming travelers. We have retained this mandatory 14-day quarantine period, even as we have increased the options for where travelers could quarantine by introducing a quarantine at residence option alongside the options to quarantine at government-sponsored quarantine facility or in a private quarantine facility. Mr. Speaker, our quarantine requirement is supported by other important factors and preventative measures that include mandatory PCR testing on arrival and at the end of the quarantine period. In addition, persons approved to quarantine in private residences are required to wear an IM Safe bracelet, a wearable device with monitoring technology. Mr. Speaker, this technology solution provides automatic location monitoring and reporting, giving alerts and notifications to a dedicated monitoring team. Mr. Speaker, the technology is backed up with boots on the ground, a mobile compliance team that has been established to respond to alerts and potential breaches in the established quarantine conditions. In addition, during the quarantine period, the mobile compliance team conducts random spot checks on persons quarantined at residence, and the call center also makes contact to check on how they are doing. Guidance and information is also provided to assist with unavoidable medical appointments and other important concerns. Mr. Speaker, despite these precautions, the public's sense of safety and well-being has been shaken in recent times by a small number of confirmed breaches of quarantine in a private residence, as well as, most recently, in a government-sponsored facility. Mr. Speaker, it is understandable that the public would expect and indeed deserves some reassurance that the measures we have put in place to safeguard the community are sufficient and effective. Through this medium, Mr. Speaker, I would like to provide some additional information that I hope will assist in this regard. Mr. Speaker, the safeguards we have implemented are robust and has kept us free from community transmission of the COVID-19 virus. But individual travelers must play their part by remaining in isolation for the stipulated period in order to keep the Cayman Islands safe. We continue to appeal to travelers to comply with the quarantine restrictions because by doing so, they are helping to protect lives. At the same time, we give notice that breaches of the COVID-19 regulations will not be tolerated, and we will seek to prosecute all confirmed violations. We are hopeful, Mr. Speaker, that the fact that any person prosecuted will be liable on conviction to a fine of $10,000 and to imprisonment for 2 years will serve as a strong deterrent. As it relates to 2 persons who have breached the quarantine requirement and received community service as part of this sentencing, I'm pleased to advise this Honorable House that the Office of the Director of Prosecutions has decided to appeal that sentence. Mr. Speaker, it should be noted that the government provides significant security resources at government-sponsored quarantine facilities. For example, prior to the recent quarantine breach, the security arrangements at that facility were as follows. A security detail is on property 24 hours a day. Security officers are stationed on each floor where there are travelers and 1 security officer on the outside of each exit. Approximately 11 security officers on the property at all times. 1 RCIP officer is on duty at the facility at all times. The RCIP vehicle is parked in front of the facility. Security patrols via patrol vehicle are conducted every 30 minutes. Every 15 minutes, there is interchanging rotation among the security officers so that there is constant movement. Mr. Speaker, after an assessment of the property and with the consideration of the recent breach, an additional 5 security officers have been recruited to work on the inside where they are in the blind spots. This comes at an additional cost of $25,000 per month. Mr. Speaker, it should also be noted that following a confirmed quarantine breach, the Travel Cayman team convenes an internal investigation to review and strengthen the current processes and close any gaps in the system that could potentially be exploited. For example, following a breach where it was discovered that a traveler had removed her I Am Safe bracelet, an additional checkpoint was implemented at the airport to confirm that the bracelets have been fitted correctly to mitigate against tampering. Mr. Speaker, while 1 breach is too many and puts us all at risk, it should be recognized that the vast majority of travelers do comply with our quarantine conditions. Since the 1st of October, there have been 6 cases associated with breaches of quarantine, 2 of which have been prosecuted and 4 of which are still under investigation. By comparison, Mr. Speaker, during that same period, over 3,500 persons have arrived on island. And of these, some 2,000 persons have received approval to quarantine at residence. By far, the vast majority of these individuals have completed their quarantine without incident. In allowing person to enter our borders and quarantine at a private residence or an approved facility, it should be noted, Mr. Speaker, that we are not operating a prison. We rely on the good character and good judgments of travelers, and of course, Mr. Speaker, persons escape from even the most secure prisons. Mr. Speaker, we believe that transparency in the reporting of breaches will help to build public confidence in our safeguards and responses. Therefore, our communications team will continue to work to alert the public to any confirmed breaches in a prompt and responsible manner. Mr. Speaker, the mobile compliance team is responsible for conducting the vast majority of quarantine at residence accommodations inspections and conducting the welfare and compliance checks of persons in quarantine at a private residence. The team is currently made up of 18 persons who have been redeployed from CBC and work or engaged to the Cayman Islands Regiment. While work is being advanced to increase the staffing complement of the mobile compliance team, given the volumes of persons expected to quarantine at private residence in the coming weeks, supply will not meet demand. As such, the Travel Cayman program has been exploring innovative ways of delivering the necessary welfare and compliance services. Mr. Speaker, we have been in communication with Hazard Management Cayman Islands, HMCI, to explore the option of engaging the Cayman Islands Community Emergency Response Teams, or CERTs, to conduct welfare checks and compliance checks of persons who are quarantined within their respective catchments. I'm happy to report that yesterday evening a proposal to engage CERT teams in the work of Travel Cayman was accepted, and work has commenced to determine which CERT teams are able and willing to participate in the program. As early as this Saturday, teams will start to be onboarded, and by early next week, CERT teams will be provided with a list of homes in their respective CERT catchment where persons are in quarantine so that they can conduct welfare compliance checks within their communities. Using these established resources, which are fully trained in disaster management, engages people at the community level in supporting with the delivery of welfare and compliance checks, which not only helps to address the resources needs, but also enhances the sense of community and sustainability of the CERTs. Mr. Speaker, here in the Cayman Islands, the main priority of our government continues to be the safety of our people. The decisive steps taken today including our quarantine restrictions, have kept the coronavirus at bay and are helping to protect lives while the virus still rages everywhere around us. While we are taking every precaution, guided by the science and supported by robust protocols and procedures, the truth is that we rely on travelers as well as their friends and loved ones to play their part by remaining in quarantine for the stipulated period in order to keep the Cayman Islands safe. I will close, Mr. Speaker, by acknowledging and thanking the many individuals from the following groups and agencies who work together to make travel to the Cayman Islands possible and safe for our travelers in our community. The Program Board and Program Board Management Office of the Phased Reopening Program, with particular recognition to Program Director Dr. Tasha Ebanks Garcia, who has been an absolute superstar. The Department of Public Safety Communications, 911, the HSA and the Public Health Department, the mobile compliance teams made up of Customs, Border Control, and Regiment Reservists, the RCIPS, who's also doing a wonderful job, Cayman Airways staff who have been redeployed, the Civil Aviation Authority, the Computer Services Department, the Department of Environmental Health, the Facilities Management Department, the Ritz-Carlton of the Cayman Islands, and Government Information Services. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand in orders 32 to ask a short question of the Deputy Governor. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, I heard in your second note at the last paragraph you read, Mr. Speaker, after an assessment of the property and with consideration for the breach, an additional 5 security guards have been recruited to work on the inside. But on the statement it says outside. I just want to confirm whether it's inside or outside.
Honorable Deputy Governor.
Perhaps the member can show me where of the page 3. Yes. Okay, so I see have been recruited to work on the outside where there are blind spots. Right. Oh, when I was saying, okay. Mr. Speaker, thank you. Thanks for that. It says, yes, Mr. Speaker, have been recruited to work out on the outside where there are blind spots. I thank the member. Mr. Speaker, please allow me again to make a statement in relation to our employment engagements survey, HR savings across the civil service, and employment opportunities for Caymanian graduates. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to share with the Parliament and the general public 3 important and outstanding achievements by the civil service and the government. Mr. Speaker, to deliver this news at the end of the year, at the end of a year that was laden with significant and unique challenges is most pleasing. Mr. Speaker, no one in this honorable House is unaware of the economic, financial, and human impacts that the COVID-19 pandemic brought with it. Despite this, the civil service, working with the elected government, persevered and delivered exceptional results above and beyond any expectations that may have been set at the beginning of the year. Mr. Speaker, on the topic of delivering exceptional results, I would like to take this opportunity to highlight extraordinary outcomes that the civil service achieved in 2020 in spite of the many challenges that we encountered. The first major achievement I would like to highlight is the financial management of our human resources across the civil service. Mr. Speaker, you will recall that within weeks of the COVID-19 lockdown, members of the public began calling for civil service salaries to be cut. Mr. Speaker, I thank the Premier and his government for resisting this call. Mr. Speaker, to cut the salaries of the very people that were leading our fight against the pandemic would have been a disaster and a morale killer for the service. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, curtailing civil service spending would have delayed our economic recovery and would have likely caused some business to close. However, Mr. Speaker, my leadership team understood very clearly that the civil service had to respond to the challenges the government was experiencing in relation to a dramatic reduction in revenue. Given this, we developed innovative ways to reduce our human resources cost. As a result, Mr. Speaker, I'm most pleased to announce today that at the end of October, the civil service has achieved a $10 million reduction in HR cost. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to say that despite this significant reduction in cost, our service levels were not compromised in the areas most critical to the government's pandemic response. In fact, Mr. Speaker, most, if not all, of those areas provided higher levels of service to ensure an advantageous result in our fight against COVID-19. Mr. Speaker, I know you will agree this is an outstanding achievement. Mr. Speaker, with these savings and financial support agreed in principle with the Cabinet, I'm able to report on the second extraordinary outcome. Mr. Speaker, over the past few years, we have seen a dramatic increase in the number of returning Caymanians seeking employment within the civil service. Mr. Speaker, we have had some success in securing employment for our talented Caymanians. For example, We created a trainee post in our anti-money laundering unit within the Attorney General's chambers and employed a young Caymanian graduate. Mr. Speaker, that program has been very successful, with a Caymanian being promoted out of that trainee post. The unit is now seeking to bring in another Caymanian trainee. We have had similar success in the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of District Administration, the Department of Community Rehabilitation, and the Prison Service. However, Mr. Speaker, we are unable to achieve these results across the civil service. Mr. Speaker, the single barrier is funding. Departments and ministries do not have flexibility built into their budgets to consistently offer training and development opportunities for our young Caymanians. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm so pleased to say that all of that changed on Tuesday of this week when I received approval in principle from Cabinet to utilize up to $1 million in HR savings to create a central fund managed by the portfolio of the civil service to fund the employment and training of our Caymanian graduates and provide training for existing civil servants who wish to engage in secondment opportunities to gain experience and skills. Mr. Speaker, I wish to record my profound thanks to the Premier and Cabinet colleagues for their universal support of this recommendation. Mr. Speaker, I can say without reservation that I have never received a faster Cabinet approval for a recommendation. In fact, Mr. Speaker, my request was for $500,000, but thanks to a suggestion from my colleague, Minister Seymour, all members of the Cabinet agreed to the sum of $1 million. Mr. Speaker, this sum of money can make the lives of so many Caymanians better by providing employment and training opportunities. Is there any better way to spend our money, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, this program is very timely given the reduction of job opportunities in the private sector as a result of the effects of COVID-19. Beginning in the first quarter of 2021, the civil service will be able to provide temporary employment opportunities to Caymanian graduates who are experiencing difficulty finding work given the current economic situation. In exchange, the graduates will provide the government with additional manpower and expertise, bolstering our existing teams and service levels. Mr. Speaker, the end goal as it pertains to this initiative is for the civil service as far as possible to retain those Caymanian graduates who prove to be high performers by transitioning them to full-time employment, as we have seen in the Attorney General's chambers. Where this occurs, it will be a great advantage outcome for our young Caymanians and indeed the civil service. Mr. Speaker, the third and final positive message for today is around our annual employee engagement survey. Remarkably, Mr. Speaker, despite these year's challenges, the civil service saw increases in both the response rate and the engagement score. Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud to say that we have achieved a record response rate of 83%, which marks a 9% increase over 2019 response rate of 74%. Similarly, our overall engagement score increased to 72%, which is 2% higher than last year's score. So, Mr. Speaker, what that means is that we have 4,138 civil servants. Basically, only about 700 of those didn't take the survey. That is a tremendous achievement for us. While we have not yet received the full results of the survey, these preliminary results are extremely encouraging and indicate a step in the right direction. I would like to give a special mention to the RCIPS, who increased their 2019 participation rate by 29%. In 2019, their participation rate was 55%, and in 2020, their participation rate was 84%. Also, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to report that 26 civil service entities achieved 100% participation rate. Mr. Speaker, as you're aware, the employee engagement score indicates the extent to which our employees feel passionate about their jobs, are committed to the organization, and put effort into their work. For the score to increase by 2% during this most trying year is an outstanding achievement and one for which we should be all proud of. In my view, these results indicate that the responsibilities placed on us as a civil service during COVID-19, namely the responsibility to keep the people of these beloved islands safe, ignited a passion within our employees. The leadership exhibited, the joined-up approach taken, and ultimately the results achieved during our response to COVID-19 strengthened our employees' commitment to the government. For the greater good, Mr. Speaker, our employees put tremendous effort into their work in 2020 and delivered life-saving results. All these things translated to increased engagement, which showed up on the employee engagement survey, as I said, with a 2% increase in the overall engagement. Mr. Speaker, I wish to record my thanks to Chief Officer McField Nixon and her dynamic team in POCS, who led our engagement survey project. They achieved world-class results. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I would like to thank the elected government for their continued support for the civil service. Additionally, I wish to recognize the efforts of our civil servants who continuously provide me with good news stories like the 3 I shared today. It is because of their hard work, their ideas, their professionalism, their drive, their discipline that the civil service can continue on its journey towards becoming a world-class organization and making the lives of those we serve better. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Commerce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, I wish to make a statement as to the circumstances and reasons why the Ministry of Commerce, Planning and Infrastructure, CPI, had to request a reallocation of funds from within the 2020 budget under Section 11.5 of the Public Management and Finance Law 2020 revision. Mr. Speaker, Cabinet granted approval to the Ministry of CPI to reappropriate funds in the amount of CI 1,372,968 from the 2020 budget to various appropriations within the ministry. Mr. Speaker, at the time of the 2-year budget submission, the ministry was confident that it would be in a position to deliver on all of the projects that were budgeted for the year 2020. However, some projects demanded more resources than anticipated. Mr. Speaker, primarily due to COVID-19 pandemic, construction prices on Ireland have increased as much as 30%. This reflects higher labor and material costs and has been verified by the ministry through the analysis of other projects, as well as in consultation with the independent quantity surveyors. Mr. Speaker, Cabinet granted approval for funding the construction completion of the Bodentown Church of God Multipurpose Hall to be used as a disaster hurricane shelter. The Ministry of CPI received CI $2.04 million for this project. However, upon evaluation of the tender received, it was recognized that the project required an additional sum of CI $550,000 to complete the main building above the budgeted amount of CI $2.04 million. Should be noted, Mr. Speaker, that these works do not include paving the parking lot, which may be required in late 2021. Mr. Speaker, as part of the National Energy Policy's solar initiative, the Ministry of CPI is incentivizing the installation of solar panels for low or affordable income homes. As a result, the Ministry is sponsoring the installation of approximately 7 solar panel systems on homes under the National Housing Development Trust. In addition, the Ministry has earmarked CI $50,000 to fund several smaller infrastructure projects, such as a small solar panel system on a bathroom block in a community park in Georgetown. These smaller projects are an important initiative of sustainability and providing employment for small local contractors. Mr. Speaker, the ministry received an increase to appropriation TP 76, Assistance for Infrastructure Development, for the completion of the Bordentown Church of God main building and the installation of the solar panels in the amount of CI 600,000, which reduces appropriation EI 71 equity investments for purchase of entity assets by CI 600,000. Mr. Speaker, it was agreed by the government that the ministry, and in particular the Facilities Management Department, procure security services to increase the number of Caymanians providing these services to the government administration building. A tender process was completed, and the tenders received were far higher than the amount provided for under the 2020-21 Facilities Management budget. Hence, the department was in need of additional funding for the contract to cover a shortfall in operational funding in the current budget. It should be noted, Mr. Speaker, that if the contract goes beyond the end of 2021, the ministry will need additional funding in the 2022-23 budget. Mr. Speaker, in order to cover the shortfall in funding for the security services contract, the ministry received an increased appropriation PAH 10, Management of Government Properties, in the amount of CI 450,000, which reduces appropriation PAH 20, Licensing, Monitoring and Enforcement of Specified Business Types, by CI 225,000, and also PAH 16, Licensing of Drivers and Vehicles, by CI $225,000. Mr. Speaker, the Ministry's Chief Officer and Senior Management Team conducted a comprehensive financial capability review of all the departments under the Ministry of CPI and recommended the creation of a Centralized Management Support Services CMSS unit in the ministry that would provide finance and accounting functions to the 4 departments under the ministry, namely the Department of Commerce and Investment, Computer Services Department, E-Government Unit, and the Facilities Management Department, that did not have their own dedicated finance staff and were not large enough or possesses the critical mass needed to justify the creation of their own finance teams. Mr. Speaker, it was determined that the CMSS unit would consist of 6 employees and would be separate and apart from the Chief Financial Officer and the finance team for administrative and operational purposes. In order to provide the requisite headcount for the unit, some existing finance-related posts were identified within the departments, and funding from these posts would be used to establish a unit, with the balance being funded via existing new posts, which were reallocated to this unit. This funding was formally transferred to the Ministry of CPI from the relevant departments. Mr. Speaker, the ministry received an increase to appropriation PAH 1, Advice and Support to the Minister of Commerce, Planning and Infrastructure, in the amount of CI $322,968, which reduced appropriation PAH 18, Technology Support Services, by CI $194,736, and PAH 10, Management of Government Properties, by $128,232. Mr. Speaker, the aforementioned exceptional circumstance transactions, which were approved by Cabinet for the Ministry of Commerce, Planning and Infrastructure during the 2020 financial period, did not cause any non-compliance with the principles of responsible financial management. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the members of the Parliament for their continued support, and thank you, and may God continue to bless these Cayman Islands.
The member for Bordentown Central, Honorable Minister, I'm sure you know that I will be having a conversation with you shortly.
Bordentown Central, Mr.
Bordentown West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise on Standing Orders, Section 32. Just to ask the Minister a brief question. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Permitted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I just want to thank the Minister with regards to having more Caymanians employed in the government admin building from a security standpoint. I won't ask him the number of security guards for security purposes. But just out of curiosity, Mr. Speaker, can the Honourable Minister tell me roughly just in terms of a range, the amount of guards, and then more importantly, what percentage are Caymanians? Thank you.
The matter of the range, what you,
In terms of the number of securities, like more than 50, less than 50.
no, that was still getting
Yeah,
an
but
understanding
just-
of how many you got. So
Yeah.
the first one, I think you should go,
Just the percentage is
the
fine.
percentages.
Thank
Honourable
you,
Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, it's about 60%, and the goal was initially to try and get all of the forward-facing and the more regularly scheduled staff to be Caymanian.
Member for Bordentown West?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, I want to reiterate my thanks to the Minister in that regard. Just out of curiosity, Mr. Speaker, are there any other initiatives with any other government departments across the board? Because one of the things that we were looking at was in terms of getting more Caymanians, especially on the security side at the government building, especially like ports and so forth. So has there been an update, or can the Minister speak to that? Thank you.
Honourable Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member for the question. And unfortunately, I don't. Facilities management falls under our ministry, and it has always been a point of discussion from even in the previous administration. So we had been working on it for a while. So I don't have a response for the other ministries.
Personal explanations,
None.
obituary and other ceremonial speeches,
None.
raising a matter of privileges,
None.
other business, private member motions, private member motion number 1 of 2020-2021, protection of marine environment shoreline, to be moved by the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Leader of the Opposition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, private members motion number 1 at 2020 to 2021 in my name, entitled Protection of Marine Environment / Shoreline, I beg to move, which reads, whereas the area along the OPY near area of Georgetown waterfront, commonly known as Red Spot, has been used as an outdoor fishing market for decades by local fishermen to clean and sell their daily catch to locals, residents, and visitors alike. And whereas this activity has become an integral part of the Cayman culture and should be preserved for all to enjoy, and whereas in recent months there has been disagreement between the fishermen and ownership of the property on occupancy thereof, and whereas the fishermen have petitioned government to assist with brokering an agreement between the fishermen and ownership of the property to ensure that this area remains a part of the cultural landscape and secure their livelihood. And whereas this property does not have any realistic developmental value because of its size and because of the applicable setback requirements, be it therefore resolved that the government considers exercising its authority under the relevant legislation to enforce and defend any and all existing prescriptive rights enjoyed by the public, or alternatively, to compulsorily acquire the said property for the public use in the interest of cultural value and for the purpose of preservation of a long-established activity by members of the public.
Is there a seconder? The Honourable Member for Savannah.
I beg to second the motion, Mr. Speaker.
Question is, be it therefore resolved that the government considers exercising its authority under the relevant legislation to enforce and defend any and all existing prescriptive rights enjoyed by the public, or alternatively to compulsorily acquire the said property for the public use in the interest of cultural value and for the purpose of preservation of a long-established activity by members of the public. Honorable Leader of the Opposition, are you ready to move on your motion?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me begin by making it abundantly clear that this motion I have thought of long and hard before bringing it to this honorable House. Mr. Speaker, I grew up, like all of us in this country, and I've always viewed and enjoyed the shorelines of this country as free citizens with respect for private property and the privacy of those who own, the proprietors. But, Mr. Speaker, there are certain areas in this country that we have all viewed as having cultural values and points of interest that has gone down through generations as areas referred to as being kept in our minds and our history as areas that we should preserve for future generations to carry on that culture and that ability to utilize. Mr. Speaker, many of us in 1998, I believe, in the late 90s, when we started, mid-late 90s, when we started naming roads in this country, we were a little apprehensive about it because hitherto there were very few roads in this country that were named. They were referred to by location and someone living on the roads that you would identify, or some tamarind tree and coconut tree or mango tree or grape tree. So there is a long history of us, of it being ingrained in us that these areas were identified because of the cultural values. Mr. Speaker, I know, and some means of identifying a particular boundary. I know when I went to school in East End, in the all-age school, East End, those of us who were from East End always had this rivalry with those from Gun Bay, because they thought, they always believe and continues to believe, that's a cultural thing, that Gun Bay was different from East End. Well, there were two different settlements, and vast undeveloped land was in between. And we would always chase the people in Gun Bay up to where we call Sam Rankin Tamarind Tree. Sam Rankin owned the property there. That tamarind tree remains there today. So when the people of East End speak of Sam Rankin Tamarind Tree, we know exactly what value it has. That was the divide line between East End and Gun Bay. And Mr. Speaker, I dare say there are similar memories of all of us who grew up in this country and have been etched in the annals of history, albeit many times in our own memory. But they have served to remind us of where we came from and who we are. Now, Mr. Speaker, from a personal perspective, my dad owned a transport truck when I was a kid, which he would pick up the different merchandise from Georgetown to take to East End. And I have fond memories of a number of areas in Georgetown, like everyone else does, particularly those from Georgetown, like the premier who grew up down here. And then I have fond memories of listening to Warren Connolly, who served many years as a legislator and vestryman, of what the waterfront meant to this country and meant to all of us. Mr. Speaker, one of the things I recall is that the waterfront was where the country was managed from. That's where the vestrymen and magistrates and politicians would gather in the morning and talk to their constituents on the wall at the waterfront, which has been called Red Spot since before all of us. So, Mr. Speaker, I would dare say that it has some cultural values that we should never erase from the memory of our people. Mr. Speaker, I believe that it should be in the hands of the people. I recognize that it is privately owned. I recognize that when it's private and absolute, then one has every right, within reason, to do as they please with their property. However, Mr. Speaker, when a property has such cultural values to a country, such cultural significance to a country, I believe that the government should at the very least try to secure that so that it can be kept in perpetuity for generations and generations to come. Mr. Speaker, I spoke briefly about Sam Rankin Tamarind Tree in East End that divide East End and Gun Bay. That has been preserved by virtue of the creation of a public right-of-way and it sits right in the middle of it. So no one owns that, and hopefully long may it survive. Mr. Speaker, from time I came to Georgetown on my father's truck, Red Spot was there. The Smiths, who had their commerce right on the other side of the road, would always be over there on the wall. There are many Georgetowners I recall who would sit on that wall. And there are many who I recall when the market was out there. I still don't know why we didn't leave that as the meat market. That's what it was. But as time goes on, the one easy way of erasing a race, a people, is covering over the cultural icons of that country. We all remember the World War II and what was tried there to wipe out and take the people off the face of the earth. One leader tried destroying all the art, the artifacts of one country. Those are valuable icons to preserve, to ensure that generations from now will know, and it will stand out in the minds of generations from now. It's already a part of our memory, but where will we be in 100 years from now? Thus, Mr. Speaker, the reason why I decided that I wanted to ensure and request that the government do what is necessary to preserve Red Spot. All my life I've seen people fish there, clean fish there. All my life. It was not as commercially driven as it is now. There were a few fishermen who would pull their boats up there, and it is a little broader now. Mr. Speaker, I didn't know who that property was for. I certainly did not even think that it was for someone. I thought it was scenic coastline owned by the government. Well, I don't know about it being, well, I don't know who Dora is, but the records will reflect that it was registered during the cadastral survey in the name of one Alfred de Costa Bird. And of course, I didn't know Mr. Bird. That was done on April 1971. And it was registered at that time as 0.09 acres. In 1971. In 1973, one Alfred da Costa Bird of Georgetown transferred on the 16th day of August 1973 in consideration of 20,000 CI dollars, sold such property to one Christopher Dorian Johnson and Kenneth Spragon, each owning half as joint proprietors. No, joint proprietors it was. Huh? It was joint proprietors. They each were shareholders. And then sometime between 2005 and 2006, one Christopher D. Johnson was made full owner of the property by virtue of affidavits and death certificates and the like of one Spragon. So, Mr. Speaker, the property privately is owned by one Christopher D. Johnson, legitimately also. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I said, that, I should say, was not finalized until 2017. Now, why that is, that was rectification of register was done on the 14th day of September 2017. Very well. Yeah, it was, but it was, the rectification was done in 2017. So, Mr. Speaker, during the COVID experience we had here, I think the public health and the minister responsible, the Minister for Commerce, in their infinite wisdom, tried to ensure that there wasn't any, they recognized that the spacing there was not available, there was insufficient land properties to keep distance, 6-foot distance for people visiting there. And they moved the fishermen over to the south terminal by the Georgetown dock. Now, Mr. Speaker, it is my understanding, and I may be wrong, but upon returning, there has been some discussions and disagreements as to the occupancy by the fishermen of that piece of property. Mr. Speaker, I don't know what kind of arrangements have been made between the owners and the fishermen over the years, but certainly they have been there long enough. If there has been no arrangements that prescriptive rights could probably come into play. But, Mr. Speaker, be that as it may, I believe the government needs to acquire that piece of property. Now, Mr. Speaker, the government has at its disposal provisions to be able to do that. And those provisions are made available under the Land Acquisition Law 1995. Most people believe that when you say compulsory, the government doing compulsory acquisition, that it's a bad thing. Well, I don't believe it's a bad thing, Mr. Speaker. Compulsory acquisition is used sparingly by any government because you don't want the government using the big stick on its citizens all the time. But when it is in the interest of the public and for public purposes, all should know. I believe in America they call it eminent domain. That all should know that in the public interest, the government has the right to acquire the property for public purposes. And in particular, in this case, where it has such cultural values to this country, I believe we should purchase it. Now, Mr. Speaker, compulsorily acquiring it does not mean that the government go in and take it and that's the end of the story. The acquisition law does not allow government to do that. The acquisition law allows government, and I should say this law needs to be updated because it says the governor needs to do it. But of course, that is cabinet now. To go in and do surveys and notify the public and the owners of that property that the government is going to acquire it in the public interest. Now, Mr. Speaker, just let me read a couple of the provisions in the Land Acquisition Law 1995 revision. Part 3 says, whenever it appears to the governor that land in any locality is likely to be needed for any public purpose, a notification to the effect shall be gazetted, and the governor shall cause copies of such notification to be exhibited at suitable places in such locality. Mr. Speaker, entry for purposes of survey, notwithstanding anything contained in any other law, as soon as a notification has been published and exhibited in accordance with Section 3, it shall be lawful for any officer, either generally or specially authorized by the governor, and for his servants and workmen, A, to enter upon, survey and take levels of any land in such locality, B, to dig or bore into the subsoil, C, to do all other acts necessary to ascertain whether the land is adaptable to the public purpose. D.
Honorable Member, we have reached that hour and I call on the Premier.
next Thursday. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move the suspension of Standing Order 10-2 in order that the business of the House may continue beyond the hour of interruption.
Question is the Standing Order 10 be suspended in order for the business of the House to continue after the hour of 4:30. All in favor, please say aye. Those against? The ayes have it. The Honorable, the Leader of the Opposition, continuing.
I can't wait to see that one. Can't wait to see that one. Mr. Speaker, I was on D to set out the boundaries of the land proposed to be taken and the intended line of work, if any, proposed to be executed thereon, and likewise and likewise. Mr. Speaker, under 7 of the law, it says negotiations for purchase. Whenever declaration has been made under Section 6, the governor shall, without delay, enter into negotiation for the purchase of the land to which the declaration relates upon reasonable terms, which shall include early possession. Then 8, Two, 7.2. It shall be necessary for the governor to await the publication of the declaration before he endeavors to conclude an agreement under this section. 3, nothing in this section shall be construed as prohibiting or delaying the procedure hereinafter provided for the compulsory acquisition of any land. Power of governor to direct compulsory acquisition. Where a declaration has been made and published as required by Section 6, and where in respect of the land to which the declaration relates, the governor is satisfied that it is not possible to conclude a satisfactory agreement under Section 7. The negotiations in connection with any such agreements have been or are being unduly delayed, or C, it is not in the public interest to enter into such negotiations, the governor may, by order under his hand, proceed to acquire and to enter upon and take possession of the land compulsorily in accordance with this law. Mr. Speaker, the law goes on to say that the court may go to court, and the different things that must be taken into consideration before the matter is concluded. Matters for consideration of the court in determining the amount of compensation to be awarded for land acquired under this law. The court shall take into consideration the market value of the land at the date of the publication of the declaration relating thereto under Section 6, the damage sustained by the person interested by reason of the taking of any standing crops or trees which may be on the land at the time of the taking possession thereof, any damage sustained by the person interested at the time of the taking possession of the land by reason of severing such land from his other land, any damage sustained by the person interested at the time of the taking possession of the land by reason of the acquisition injuriously affecting his other property, movable or immovable, in any other manner, or his earnings, if, in consequence of the acquisition of the land by the governor, the person interested is compelled to change his residence or place of business, the reasonable expense incidental to such change, and if damage bona fide resulting from diminution of the profits of the land between the time of the publication of the declaration under Section 6 and the time of the taking possession of the land. So, Mr. Speaker, it's not like people do not get paid for their property. It's just that the government needs it in the interest of the public good. Mr. Speaker, and then payment of compensation. On the making of an award under Section 11, the governor shall tender payment of the 11, that is, when the court awards it, payment of the compensation awarded to the person interested entitled thereto according to the award, and shall pay it to them unless prevented by one or more of the contingencies mentioned in subsection 2. Subsection 2 says, if they do not consent to receive it, or if there is no person competent to alienate the land, or if there is any dispute as to the title to receive the compensation, or as to the apportionment of it, the governor shall deposit the amount of the compensation in court, provided that any person admitted to be interested may receive such payment under protest as to the sufficiency of the amount. Provided further that no person who has received the amount otherwise than under protest shall be entitled to make an application under Section 17. Provided also that nothing herein shall affect the liability of any person who may receive the whole or any part of any compensation awarded under this law, to pay the same to the person lawfully entitled thereto. Notwithstanding anything in this section, the government may, instead of awarding a money compensation in respect of any land, make any arrangement for a person having a limited interest in such land, either by the grant of other lands in exchange, the remission of land revenue on other lands held under the same title, or in such other way as may be equitable, having regard to the interests of the parties concerned. Nothing in subsection 3 shall be construed to interfere with or limit the power of the governor to enter into any arrangement with any person interested in the land and competent to contract in respect thereof. Money deposited in court. If any money is deposited in court under Section 27(2), and it appears that the land in respect thereof, whereof the same was awarded, belonged to any person who had no power to alienate the same, the court shall order the money to be invested in the purchase of other lands to be held under the like title and condition of ownership as the land in respect of which money shall have been deposited was held. Or, if such purchase cannot be effected forthwith, then in such approved securities as the court thinks fit, and shall direct the payment of the interest or other proceeding arising from such investment to the person or persons who would, for the time being, have been entitled to the possession of the said land, and such monies shall remain so deposited and invested until the same be applied. And Mr. Speaker, it goes on with other provisions. Now, Mr. Speaker, that says that nothing will be taken from anyone without proper compensation. The state cannot take lands without the proper value applied. Now, Mr. Speaker, the advent of the cadastral survey in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s, brought us to the point where we know the value of every piece of land in this country. They all have boundaries, and we can do a value on those properties. Mr. Speaker, for the purposes of this exercise, let me read from the Development and Planning Regulations. So, when a piece of property is properly earmarked and ownership is known, whether it's the Crown or otherwise, there are certain things that can be done on it. There are certain things that cannot be done on it, but all things to be done on it or not done on it is recorded in the development planning law or regulations for development in this country. Whether it's to plant a flag post or put a chair on it or anything else. But any development on that property must go through a planning process, an application process. Now, some lands, because of their location, has no developmental value, i.e., nothing can be built thereon, because they're not large enough to meet the planning requirements, the planning criteria for development. Mr. Speaker, in the case of this piece of property, for the benefit of all, let me read from the Development and Planning Regulation 2020 revision, page 13, section 8, section 8.10, subsection 10. And these are the requirements for development within Georgetown. The following provisions apply to waterfront properties. Waterfront property, that is, A, in central Georgetown, within the area enclosed from a point on the waterfront, map reference MM 593331, in brackets, Eden Rock. We know where Eden Rock is. Thence, in a northerly direction, along such waterfront to map reference MM 597344, Whitehall Bay, in bracket. That's by Lobster Pot. Thence, due east to the edge of the road reserve of North Church Street, thence southerly along the western road reserve boundaries of North Church Street, that is coming back south, Harbor Drive and South Church Street to map reference MM 94331, that is Eden Rock again. Thence due west to the point of commencement, back down to Whitehall Bay. New buildings or addition to existing buildings may be permitted, but any such building, including ancillary building structures and walls, shall not at any point be closer than 75 feet to high water mark. But this restriction shall not apply to any works carried out by the Highway Authority, established under the Roads Law 2005 revision, where the works are for the protection of the existing road against undermining or scoring by the sea, or to any works carried out by the Port Authority established under the Port Authority Law 1999 revision, where the works are for the improvements or repairs of the Georgetown port facility. So, Mr. Speaker, that means your closest setback is 75 feet. The closest your building can come to the high water mark is 75 feet. And that including ancillary buildings too. That piece of property, red spot, I would venture to say about 10 feet from the high water mark. Because in Georgetown waterfront, the boundary is to the road. And your property starts from the road out to the high water mark. We have all driven by there. The high water mark on one side of it is the iron shore. The high water mark on the other side of it is the little beach that is down there. Mr. Speaker, you couldn't lay a piece of 2x4 down on that piece of property unless you got yourself in trouble. You couldn't plant a flag post on that because you get yourself in trouble. You can't put a bench on that because you get yourself in trouble. From a developmental perspective. So it has no developmental value. But certainly it has a financial value. But it also has a cultural value to the people of this country and its future generations. And it has a value for the livelihood of our people, many of whom makes their livelihood there. It also has a tourism value, and it seems like it has a governor's value because your governor come go out to clean fish. They don't stay long after that, so they better be careful. But I am saying, Mr. Speaker, each and every one of us at one time or the other has gone there to buy fish. I recall when I was a minister, I was asked by a foreign journalist what I was going to do about the fishermen out there selling spoiled fish. So I said, well, how would I know they're selling spoiled fish? They said, well, that's the rumor. I said, well, there's a way of testing to see if it's spoiled, you know. And they said, well, what's that? I said, use the thermometer my mother used to use. And I stuck my finger in the air. So they said, well, what's that? I said, stick it with your finger. You'll know if it's spoiled. It's going to be soft. If it's firm, it's not spoiled. Mr. Speaker, that has been there for a long time, you know. As I said earlier, longer than all of us. And the only thing can be done there is by NRA. They can repair that wall. That's the only thing can be done by that piece of property from a construction perspective. I believe that government needs to pay the people for it. Now I understand, and I'm hearing these rumors that they've gone into some agreement with, and I'm sure the government will get up and say that. I heard the Premier say he's going to show me the error of my ways. And I'm waiting for that. Think I'm afraid to know that, to admit that I made an error? No, I'm not. He knows that. But I understand that the government has gone into some agreement with them, with the owner, to give it to the people in perpetuity. But the fishermen got to come off it. So you're going to bequeath me something for the people, for the public. Aren't the fishermen the public too? They're part public, you know. Everybody has a home in this country. If they don't have a shelter, if they don't have a cover over their head, they are a member of the public. They are people. They are the people of this country. Therefore, they must, sometimes they don't, but they must share equally in the spoils of the country. So, if you're giving it to the people, Mr. Speaker, who you think will take care of it? The money is from this legislature, you know. So, Mr. Speaker, where you think that money comes from? Hello. The public. So we must spend the fisherman money on it to maintain it in perpetuity, but they can't go on it. No. Pay him for it. Whatever it costs, pay him for it, because there is no financial value that can be placed on cultural values. None. It is easier for us to negotiate our way through potholes all over this country and go and purchase that piece of property than to leave it there under someone else. It is necessary for the public use. It is absolutely necessary. And the negotiations have not reached the point where the person will sell. Gazette it. And let's take the property. Of course they'll go to court. Somebody got to give up at some stage. We are prepared to use the public funds to fight for everything, but for a right to give up people and maintain their culture. We'll fight for the separation of powers. All I'm saying is, Mr. Speaker, let us consider paying the person for it. That's all it is. And if they will not agree, just doing it by compulsory acquisition through the process, all it is notifying the people that we need the property and we would like to have it for this purpose. We need to tell the public through that gazetted process why we are doing this with their money. Now this law needs to change too, because the old English that is in that, I would hope that the AG could get his people to put some modern legislation in place so people can understand it. Huh? I seem to be doing well. No, Mr. Speaker, I believe that it is necessary for us to, in order to do it and pay the people for it. It has a value to them too. Mr. Speaker, everything in life has a value. And if you want it, you have to pay that value. No, they can't be unreasonable. Mr. Speaker, that value extends to everything in life. And if the government wants it, we have to pay. I recall, Mr. Speaker, when the Premier and I were in Cabinet.
Better days.
I ain't going that far. The Minister for Tourism from Town, Mr. Clifford, brought a paper for us to acquire a piece of property adjoining the public beach in Town. Coldwood Beach. You were there, you and him. Yeah. Here and my good friend from Savannah now. And no one could find the owners of it. But we found out that last address was somewhere in Asia, one of the Asian countries. So we advertised it in that country for months. Did the evaluations and deposited the monies into a bank for the arrival of a claimant. I would venture to say that money is still there, Mr. Speaker. But then we took possession of the property. Compulsory acquisition. I don't know what has transpired since then, Mr. Speaker, so I will not venture into that. But that's how it's done. The person was not here. We could not find him. Prior to leaving Cabinet, I was told that there was information that he had deceased, and it would stay there until such time. I had the fortune of being involved with a lady right in town too, that we didn't finalize it. But it was me she called to do something about it, that she wanted to bequeath to the country. I don't think that has been completed yet. But and that has cultural values too, and I would encourage all of us to try and get that done, the government. But right now, Mr. Speaker, that piece out there. And I believe that the government needs to do the publication and then go into negotiations with the owner of that property. That's what compulsory acquisition is about. It's not that you're not being paid. The government needs to make a decision that they want that property for public purposes and for the use of the public. Gazette it, and then go into negotiations with the person. That's what needs to happen. Let me borrow a word from my good friend from Savannah. Pussyfooting around with this, gotta stop. Thank you, Mr.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? The Honorable the Minister of Commerce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, since the honorable member from East End went into some history on how we got to today on the fish market. Mr. Speaker, during the shelter-in-place time over the summer, as we were emerging out of that and reopening the economy, I was contacted by the commercial fishermen asking if they would be able to return to fishing. I consulted with the authorities, and it was determined that there was a need. There was certainly a shortage of fish in the supermarkets, and if you could get it, it was quite expensive. And also, if they were licensed, we would be able to issue, under the regulations, the approval for them to operate. And so I set out to contact them all. I met with them, and we put together a team in DCI to contact each one and to get them all licensed. I think 2 out of the 7 or 8 had already had a commercial fishing license or distribution license. And so we were able to, within a matter of a week or so, get them all licensed and approvals for them to return fishing. I was then contacted by the commercial fishermen again to say that they rely on the fish vendors on the waterfront to sell the remaining fish that they do not sell to the supermarkets or to the hotels and restaurants. And considering that the hotels were all closed, they would have excess fish and would really rely on these fish vendors to remove the remainder of that fish. And so I had been contacted at the same time by the member from Georgetown Central, and then I contacted one of the representatives from the fish vendors and discussed it with them. We presented a proposal to the public health authority, or to the authorities, to reopen the fish market at what is being referred to today as Red Spot. And we drew out a plan, and it was decided that, or they felt that they would not be able to exercise proper social distancing, both for the customers and for the vendors themselves. So I set out to negotiate with the Port Authority on the South Terminal, where we felt we could lay that out and they would have the ability to wrap the line around the rotunda there, and they would have the 6-foot social distancing. We could put the tables along the dock 6 feet apart as well. In fact, the vendors are very supportive and volunteered to be tested beforehand, which we did. This also allowed the commercial fishing vessels to come and offload. We put up a fence separating them from the vendors and allow them to offload the fish there for the vendors. So it all worked rather well at the time. Mr. Speaker, I was then contacted by the owners of Red Spot, Mr. Johnson, to ask if the vendors were going to remain where they are, or whether they will be returning. I said I had heard that they're desirous of returning to the spot. I then asked him to come in for a meeting, and we discussed government purchasing the property from him. He felt that he did not want to sell the property. He wanted to create what he considered an area for the public to use that property and clean it up and put seating, etc., and a little plaque with the story of the cove. I said to him that I would discuss it with the vendors, and I would look at opportunities to relocate them if they were so interested. And I called a meeting with the vendors here because we were in the house at the time. It was later reported in the press as a protest, but in fact it was an organized meeting that I called. And I presented to them options. Some said absolutely not, some said those are interesting. But at the end of the meeting, it was decided that I would go back and speak to Mr. Johnson and say to him that they were desirous of staying there, and we would then go from there negotiating how that would happen. Unfortunately, it received some negative publicity, and Mr. Johnson then pulled out of the discussions. After much back and forth, and with the assistance of the Premier, we were able to restart discussions with Mr. Johnson again. And we were able to come to an agreement with Mr. Johnson that saw the property being put in a trust for the use of the people of the Cayman Islands in perpetuity. And he had some other concerns that on that particular spot that were valid. And he suggested that perhaps the fishermen would relocate in the same cove, but on the opposite side where he has property bordering with the Thompson family. I then went and discussed this with the fish vendors. We agreed that we would develop the opposite side for them. And across the street, we would also develop restroom facilities and parking. Mr. Speaker, this was welcomed then by the vendors. In fact, Mr. Speaker, let me reverse and say that the representative from Georgetown Central was also included in the discussions, as the particular site lands square on the border of Georgetown North and Georgetown Central. And so we had discussions with them. They agreed we would put bathrooms, speed up plans we had for public bathrooms across the street, and a parking dedicated to the fish market. This they found acceptable, and it solved a few problems for them, obviously having the restrooms. And secondly, they were having congestion issues with the parking lot next to them belonging to the Cabana restaurant, who was desirous of reserving those parking spaces for his clientele. And so, Mr. Speaker, we all agreed that whilst we could go down the long road of fighting in court for prescriptive rights, or whilst we could go down, and the member painstakingly took time to read the law to us and explain that what has to be done, the process, and that it could end up in court, and that it's not so much I think you used the word big stick, but that you would pay the person. I agree with all of that. But what we ended up with was a solution where the property is still going to be held for the people of the Cayman Islands. One of the few conditions on that trust would be that there would be no commercial activities, because he wanted everyone to feel free to go and use it, to sit, to watch the sunset, whatever they wanted to do there, without having to hassle with commercial activity. And so we contacted the Thompson family. They were 100% supportive as well. And so it's a different block and parcel number on the other side, Mr. Miller. Someone was asking how they would then sell fish. And so we all came to an agreement. I have accepted to develop it under the Georgetown Revitalization. The process has already started looking at how we can best do that, as well as earlying up plans for restrooms and parking across the street, which would be suitable or would service the fish market. So, Mr. Speaker, again, the government felt, or I certainly felt after a lot of hard work and some very tense days in dealing with this matter, that we had found a solution that suited everyone, where we didn't have to use a big stick, we didn't have to end up in court, long protracted negotiations and perhaps battles, but we ended up having a cultural spot secured for the people of the Cayman Islands for perpetuity, and we ended up with a suitable location, or an acceptable location, I should say, by the fish vendors, with the supporting parking and restroom facilities right there next to a pedestrian crosswalk as well. And we have started the process of finalizing those agreements. We would also include in that the properties, or wherever the market is, would have the necessary insurances to protect the vendors, etc. The fish vendors actually asked if we could also put together a set of a set of rules and guidelines for the market as well, code of conduct, etc. They're all 100% supportive of the opportunity to have a restart and to develop a proper fish market for them to be able to continue to make a living in the way that they have enjoyed over the last several years there as a fish market. And so, Mr. Speaker, not to belabor the matter, that is simply where we are as a government. We have negotiated a solution, and we have entered into an agreement in good faith with the property owner, and we have a solution that is satisfactory to all parties involved, and therefore we cannot accept the motion at this time as presented by the member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? The member for Georgetown Central.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to give my contribution to the motion before this Honorable House. Motion number one, private member's motion brought by the Honorable Opposition Leader. Mr. Speaker, I was hoping that this topic would not have to come to the Parliament at this particular point, due to the fact of what the Honorable Minister said earlier in respect to the efforts to avoid using the long stick. But I do respect the Leader of Opposition's intent in respect to bringing this motion to the House. But as the representative upon which this parcel of land falls squarely in, I am obligated to speak on this motion. Mr. Speaker, I will not go over the history of the location, because I think the Honorable Leader of Opposition adequately did so. Matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, I think I learned a few things in there based on his early part of his contribution. Mr. Speaker, I also want to take this opportunity to say that the Minister and I have talked greatly upon this topic, as I was really upset at the start of the discussions about the fishermen not being able to go back to the location. And I had to remind myself that I am a representative of the good people of Georgetown Central and the people of the Cayman Islands. And sometimes you get more done with honey than with vinegar. So though I was upset, I took the time to try to mend the fences with the minister opposite and the minister that is in charge, particularly with the revitalization of Georgetown. And Mr. Speaker, as he rightfully said, throughout the discussions, myself and the minister and the fishermen had many discussions about what's the best course of action moving forward. Mr. Speaker, the Leader of Opposition is 100% correct in respect to what the government can do to acquire this property. But I think it's incumbent upon all of us as members to see if we can exhaust all options of resolution with the least amount of conflict, because no landowner wants to feel the strong arm of a government, even though I do agree sometimes that is necessary. Mr. Speaker, before I go on, I want to summarize the ending of what my contribution will be about, but then to give some information afterwards. I do believe that we should give the minister and this administration the necessary time to resolve the matter, to show that we are members of Parliament that was willing to work together with those who are landowners in what is in the best interest of the country. And if that is exhausted and there's no resolution, then we will take the necessary steps on behalf of the good people that we represent to get the end result upon which we want. Mr. Speaker, I think that the contribution by the minister gave a good summary, but though myself, given the leverage to the minister to control the matter, I am limited on information in respect to the whole deal that was agreed, simply to the fact that I was not involved in the negotiations. The negotiations that I was involved in was directly with the fishermen themselves, the men on the ground, the grassroots people. So I wasn't in the meetings where the discussions and agreements as to what the deal would look like. So I am subject to the minister's statements as to what will ultimately be the end result. And exactly what he said to this Honorable House is exactly what he repeated to me after having negotiations on behalf of the fishermen downtown and the good people trying to secure this cultural and historical location for the benefit of the people. Now, Mr. Speaker, you heard the Honorable Minister talk about the landowner wanting to put the land in a trust in perpetuity for the good people of the Cayman Islands, but wanted the behavior or the actions of selling fish not to be particularly on the parcel of land which is identified under the Lands and Survey Law as parcel OPY5. Now, Mr. Speaker, we've heard that the negotiations are to suggest that the fishermen move to the south of that property, which the landowner also holds a parcel of land. Now, Mr. Speaker, I am happy to say that I grew up right around this area, and I've spent many of my days growing up right there on that corner watching my father sell fish. As a child coming home from Georgetown Primary School on Mary Street, after getting out of school, I knew I could run down by the bay and say, "Daddy, give me $5 so I can go buy Mr. Gould's shop by Candace. And I have fond memories of seeing what fish was brought in, the big tunas and the big old groupers, before we put some more controls on the grouper population. So my point is, Mr. Speaker, I know this area very, very well. And the area to the south, upon which we've heard the indication for them to move, has a different landscape than the area to the north upon which they acquire right now, or reside in respect to their fishing activities. And that iron shore to the south is rather high off of the ground, which creates much difficulty for the ease of the nature of which they're performing now, which offers that cultural and historical element of a Caribbean island that is also important to our tourism product. Mr. Speaker, I want to lay on the floor of this honorable House an affidavit that has been sent to the Register of Lands to Ms. Sophia Williams to register a claim to this property, which I understand has been generated by members in the community. And I want to...
Can I have a copy before you attempt to lead?
Mr. Speaker, just a procedural matter. As you can imagine, I am still growing in my role as a representative. Can you clarify when you say do you need a report before I speak to it? Do you need to examine it first? Or do you get it, then I can continue to speak to it?
This is several pages long. Are you going to quote from it, from the document?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Well, if you're going to quote from it, not all of it, or all of it?
No, Mr. Speaker, definitely not all of it, some parts of it, just for reference purposes.
Well, let me follow. Continue. I will follow, and if you're skipping from page to page, let me, please quote the page, because it's, as I said, several pages long.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will do so. Mr. Speaker, the document you have before you is a letter sent to Ms. Sophia Williams, the Register of Lands, and it was sent on November the 25th, 2020. It says, Dear Madam, read Georgetown Commercial Section OPY Parcel 5, known as Dora Bay, / Red Bay claim.
Red
Spot claim by adverse possession pursuant to the Limitations Law, 1996 revision, and Section 136 of the Registered Land Law, 2018 revision. Now I'm just going to read, Mr. Speaker, the first part of that letter and then go over just some parts of the rest of it. It says, attached is our affidavit for the claim for adverse possession of the subject parcel of land to be registered in our names. Also attached are witness statements by Mr. Herbert Brown, better known as Mr. Blinky, Joseph Lander Watler, certified honorable, and Louis Ricardo.
Cert on. It's Ladner Watler, cert on.
Cert on, and Mr. Louis Ricardo Tatum. I apologize for the abbreviation, lack of knowledge about what the cert on, I thought it was certified and honorable, abbreviation was for, but certification badge of honor. I learned something new today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the Premier. Other witness statements and supporting evidence will be submitted to you. This letter, the affidavit, and the witness statements are submitted in support of this claim for adverse possession of Parcel 5. We look forward to your acknowledgement of this claim, and should you require additional information, please do not hesitate to contact us. Now, Mr. Speaker, I present this to the floor of the House so all members realize the significance, because it has a lot of historical value within the document. In the document, there's affidavit claims of how long people have been fishing there. It has pictures, and just for your reference, Mr. Speaker, you have a picture from 1994, and I know the fishermen been fishing there from, my memory serves me, from when I was 5 years old, which would be in 1985, do I recall my father out there fishing. And then you have other pictures as the land updates. You have 2018 map, you have the 2008 map. You have pictures on there where you heard the Honorable Opposition Leader talk about governors going there to be a part of our culture and experience what we are as Caymanians. So it gives the significance of the identification of that location and what it means to us. Outside of the, and on page 9, you see, Mr. Speaker, a very, very old picture from the early 80s of older fishermen, and I think on there it has some of the names of the persons who were fishing, and they're what look like elephant pants. That's how old the picture is. The style of elephant pants was in the 70s, no, I believe. Could be even older. Bell bottoms? Bell bottoms. Mr. Speaker, my point is that the picture gives you an indication of how old and how long the good people of Cayman, and particularly those of Georgetown, have been using this location. Just a matter of reference, Mr. Speaker. Believe it or not, there is a picture within the study books that we offer to the children at our government schools and the primary schools, talking about culture and heritage. And there's a picture of my young father holding up a grunt in that book. And I remember when, because they didn't have that book at the First Baptist Christian School where my children went to, but some of the educators gave me some of the books to give to the school. And it was so cool to say to my children to look through it, and one of them say, "That our grandfather?" So I was hoping to find the book, but I couldn't find it last night, just in case I want to refer to it. But that location is even used for reference in educational exercise books that we have to show the significance of that location. Now, Mr. Speaker, I just want this document, and whoever was involved in putting it forward, I won't call any names, but there are advocates out there to protect our cultural and historical interests of the people who try to help the citizens, and I want to say thanks to them for doing this, and now it's in the record books of this Honorable Parliament. Mr. Speaker, I say all of that only to highlight the significance of this. As a member of Parliament, it is important that I recognize the rights of all persons with their lands. But as a community and as a family of people, we also have to recognize the importance of our identification of who we are. And Mr. Speaker, I want to encourage the owner of the land to continue with the negotiation that is in the best interest of the people. I do not think the idea of moving them from that location to the other one may be the best solution. I personally believe if the owner wanted to show a commitment to the good people of the Cayman Islands, together as a family called Cayman, would be to just transfer the land, protect it for the people, not the government, because government can sell land, but protect it for the people for whatever use they've been using it for. To say they cannot have commercial activity there is illogical in my humble opinion, Mr. Speaker, because the commercial activity is what they've been doing for the last over 40 years since I've been alive. But I think, though I say that, I want to give the support to this government to exercise as much negotiations so we don't have a situation where it's come to the stage of compulsory acquisition. We are all in this together, including the landowner, who have been a part of our Cayman family for some, I can't recall exactly how long he's had that property now, but I know he's a Caymanian. Maybe not generational like all of us in this honorable house, but he's a part of our family now, and I think for us all to live in harmony, allow the negotiation process. I think the owner has already made a step forward in that attempt to keep the harmony amongst us all by showing that he is willing to support the protection of our historical elements on that location. So I want to offer the minister and this government my continued support until all options are exhausted. But I think we should renegotiate or reconsider the concept of moving them from one side to the other. Now, I was not there within the discussions to know why the determination of moving them from one side to the other was there, but I recognize that moving them from one side to the other is somewhat less efficient in respect to the offerings to the local fishing market than where the high cliff rock would be. And I know the minister said that the fishermen were in agreement with that, but I'm glad to say that I talk to the fishermen almost every day. I take pride in staying in my community and talking to those on the ground, the average person every day, because they're the meat of who we represent. And the attitude I received from them was, yes, we agreed to it because we want to make sure we get something, as opposed to, ideally, what would be the best case is they stay exactly where they are on that particular part, but with the improvements that are necessary that may cause the concern for the landowner. I think the minister has already highlighted that there's easy ways to resolve the insurance concerns. Now, if the land was sold, which is ultimately the easiest way to do this, and I know all members of this honorable house will be willing to commit the necessary funds to acquire it, then the landowner will no longer have to be worried about any risk of claim of injury to anybody there. So though I was hoping that this motion would not have to come in the public domain and award the minister the necessary times to do the negotiation, which is what government does every day, regardless of which government it is, to keep the balance of harmony, have negotiations on behalf of the people, and they have to be given adequate time to do that. But since we're here, I think it's important that we recognize the best solution in respect to this is the full acquisition without any restrictions whatsoever, so the good people's representatives, and that's the elected members of this house and the next term, to make the necessary decisions on what's best for the cultural and historical norms of the people, as long as it can't be sold. And I would respect that request to say, if I sell it to you, it can't be sold to anybody else, and it'll always be for the people. So, Mr. Speaker, though I respect the concept of a trust, I do have my reservations in respect to that. And I think we all agree. I don't think there has been any dispute by anybody that have had any discussions about this topic of the fish market, that is not an important location to the country as a whole. You see, Mr. Speaker, in my wrapping up, I want to say this. We have been slowly allowing the little small things, the little small freckles on our face that make us who we are. Now you may look at Kenneth Bryan, you say, if you look closer, there's a little scar on the side of his face. Now if that scar goes away, I'm no longer Kenneth. What I'm trying to get at, Mr. Speaker, is the little things that identify who we are as Cayman slowly start to get swept away, then we're no longer going to be Cayman. And Mr. Speaker, in my analogy approach, this little spot is not just a scar on the face. That little spot is like an eye on your face. It's so important to the identification of Cayman, particularly when we speak about cruise tourism and stayover tourism. Because I know everybody in this honorable house have seen at one stage where there's a Caucasian man out there with his fishing pole in the hopes to catch a tarpon and go back home and say, I was in the Cayman Islands and I caught a big one, honey. I know we've all seen it. And we can't allow that to be erased in any capacity. And the more we allow these little things to be chipped away, the more we lose our identity. And I think this is one of them that, though my first approach to it was one of, boy, this is rubbing me the wrong way, I had to step back and say, you know what? We can solve this problem with some honey. And I hope that the minister, I will not be supporting the motion at this particular point for it to be done by compulsory acquisition. But I'll give a little bit of warning, maybe not the best word to use because it creates a negative connotation, but I'll say this. If there isn't a good solution found in the best interest of the people of the Cayman Islands, and the good people of the Cayman Islands select me to be back a representative of this House, after all options are exhausted and we can't find the best solution, if we can't, which I know we will, then I will be the forerunner or the front runner in respect to what this motion is intending to accomplish. But I'll leave it in the capable hands of the minister and this administration to prove to the people of the Cayman Islands that before this administration is done, they can find a solution with the landowner that the good people of the Cayman Islands can be proud of, and that we can get past this small little concern of diminishing identity of our country. So that's how I see it, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, unless you ask for any more, that's my contribution, and I thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Honorable member for Georgetown Central, are you still intent on laying the
Yes,
paper?
Mr. Speaker, I intend to lay that.
Okay, I have no problem with it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? The member for Northside.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the cultural significance of Great Sport is well known. I have several members of my constituency that fishing during the week and come to Great Sport on a Saturday and a Sunday to sell their fish. And I've had representation from them that the government needs to acquire this property. And I understand from the minister in responding that he has, or is in the process of negotiating a trust agreement with conditions attached to it to allow these people to use, or different people to use this spot in perpetuity. I'm not comfortable Mr. Speaker, with those kind of agreements. I like the certainty of government ownership. And our forefathers put the acquisition law in place for exactly this kind of use. I also support, after the compulsory acquisition, if compulsory acquisition is necessary, I was interesting to hear that the government's first option was to buy the property so that the government owned the property, and their first option was not some kind of agreement for use of the property. I like their first option of buying the property so that the people own it, and it cannot be sold then unless it comes to this Legislative Assembly for permission to sell it, unless it's for educational purposes, I believe, or agriculture. And I can't imagine anybody planting cassava down there or building a school. Right? So, Mr. Speaker, in my constituency many years ago, we had an agreement with a developer where the public beach in Cayman was a wonderful 100-foot lot right next to the Rum Pint restaurant. While I was the representative in the 80s, the developers, although the people had been using it for several years as a public beach, got a good price for the piece of property and sold it. When I found out about that, I went to meet with the developers and express my mild dissatisfaction with that transaction and leaned on them to transfer all of what they intended to be public lands to government ownership. And that's how we got the Kaibo campsite. That's how we got the public beach below Cayman. That's how we got the public beach above Cayman. But that is government property. My concern about this is what changes can be made to these trust agreements. I'm not a trust lawyer, so I don't know. But I would suspect that if there are conditions attached to it, those conditions can be renegotiated in the future. And I would be, the only concern I have with the Leader of the Opposition motion is now that we know there are two parcels of land involved, OPY5, and I was told earlier today or yesterday at Lands and Registered there was a OPY6, but I don't see that on the maps that the member for Georgetown Central has just tabled, but I see a OPY7. So maybe we need to amend the motion to compulsory acquire both OPY5 and OPY7, because we will then have total control of the whole little bay. Because I have concerns, and the members of people of my constituency who go there to sell fish are very concerned that the topography of the southern end, which I believe would be OPY7, does not lend itself to the same kind of facilities that they have on OPY5. And if you look at the map that the member for Georgetown Central has just tabled, it is quite clear that it is not the same size, it's much smaller. The distance from the road to the water is quite a bit less, and I think there would be some difficulty in accommodating the number of people that use that place to sell fish on a weekend in particular. During the week, there's usually just one or two guys there, but there are times that on a weekend it gets quite crowded. I also support the minister's pledge, shall I put it that way, that the government is willing to build restrooms and parking on the other side of the road. But that does not reduce my concerns about having a trust agreement for the property as opposed to government owning the property. I believe there is safety and security in government purchasing the property, and I support the motion brought by the Leader of the Opposition to purchase the property and not rely on some generosity in a trust agreement by a private landowner of what they will allow on the property in the future and what they will prevent. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? If not, I'll call on the mover for his right of reply. The Leader of the Opposition, the member from East End.
Just making sure I get the time right, it's 5:45. Oh, you can take it now because you gotta get your two.
In accordance with that warning, I think we better take our evening break. Six.
And that means I get a night to write my contribution to the legal bill, so that's good.
We shall come back at 6:15.
Like, look them, it is so cute. The other day, I did some estimations and I did a post